Can Ozzie survive in Miami? While the new Marlins manager serves a 5-game suspension from the dugout, a new ESPN poll of Cuban Americans shows there's still some ill will towards the Venezuelan manager. Of the 200 Cuban Americans polled, 1 in 3 believe Ozzie should be fired. Nearly half have a negative view of Guillen, and more than half believe his apology was not enough. Can Ozzie survive this?
You know, I think Cookie Rojas, former player, former coach, now broadcaster, I think he might have put it best when he said it opened up a wound, but eventually it's going to scab. There's going to be a scar. It's going to be there forever. It might be the most memorable thing Ozzie has done in his entire career, which is saying a lot when it's all said and done.
He did win a World Series.
Doesn't matter. You look up on Google, see if the first thing that comes up after you type Ozzie Guillen is World Series. So it might be the most memorable thing he does, and it's going to be a scar that's there forever. However, will he survive? I think it's clear he's going to survive. You know, the steps he's taken so far not only helps him sort of recover from this, but it has to affect that franchise in the box office for him to not survive, and that's not going to happen.
Not gonna happen.
I mean, there are pockets of extreme Cuban Americans who feel very strongly about this and are going to protest. They're going to keep their money away from the Marlins. They're going to do early on when Ozzie gets back in that stadium. He's probably going to hear pockets of boos here and there. And again, there's the protesters outside that are probably going to be consistent for a while. But in the overall, it's not going to be enough to affect that team, that franchise in that new stadium for the first year. The novelty of that is still going to overwhelm in terms of box office, in terms of bringing people in, more than Ozzie's comments. So I just don't see how this is going to get possibly worse for him. I don't.
Okay. Yeah, I'm with you. I think he had to take his lumps over it. You know, when you open up a can of worms like this, especially in that community, you know, there's certain topics you should just stay away from. That's one of them, and he went there. So he has to deal with it.
I'm not sure that's the case anymore. I'm not sure that that's what the poll is telling us. No?
Well,
I don't know.
But the poll's telling you that there are varying levels of anger and
Skip, what I'm saying is he's suspended for 5 games for something he said in some magazine. So it does have an effect because...
But if you want to talk about a wrist slap...
but it's still... Ownership is saying, dude, you got to calm down
Rob, if it's
here.
anyone other than someone of Latin descent, particularly, let's just say anybody other than Ozzie, who has a lot of goodwill equity built up with fans and media, is he fired?
I don't know. It depends on who the person is. It really, you know what I mean, Jay? That's so open-ended. I don't know who the other guy would be or manager. All I'm saying is I wouldn't have fired him. I agree with the suspension. Let him sit down, let him cool off for a little bit. But the thing is, he will survive long-term, especially because they do have a good team that I think is getting to the World Series. They do have a beautiful new ballpark, and there are people who won't come. But there were always people who weren't going to come anyway and were looking for any reason not to, whether hot dogs were too much or parking was too much or whatever. There's always those people out there. But I'm saying there will be enough. If this team plays well and wins like I expect them to, people will return to the ballpark.
I'll tell you.
And it'll be a bump, but it won't be a pothole.
I'll tell you how obvious it is, or an obvious sign that there's such varying levels of disgust about this, even among the Cuban-American community. Gabby Sanchez, who's a Cuban-American player on that own team, before Ozzie even apologized officially via the press conference, said it was all drama for nothing. This is a Cuban-born guy who's saying it was nothing. It was kind of a nothing statement. Now, granted, he's on that team. He wants to support his manager and everything else. But that just goes to show you that if he was really that passionate about it, he wouldn't have said that.
That's exactly what I'm getting at here. When we first addressed this topic on Monday's show, I quickly disqualified myself. I don't get this because I'm not there. I did work at the Miami Herald for 3 years. You grew up there. You're not Cuban-American, but you certainly know the community, and you have a pretty good finger on the pulse. And yet, did I misread this? Did I jump to a conclusion on Monday? All I could do is, in a vacuum, from what I know, Ozzie Guillen should not survive. He should be fired immediately because, to your question to Rob, it's what I said on Monday. Any other manager, most other managers would have been fired. Charlie Manuel, Jim Leland, your guy in Detroit, Ron Washington. If any of these guys say that, I'm pretty sure it's so over the line, given this circumstance at this moment with this new ballpark in Little Havana, that you are gone. you cannot survive. That's just me, and I'm looking at it completely from a distance, maybe in a good way, because of what you said. You've got a manager here who's getting a pass on two fronts. He is of Latin descent. He is Spanish speaking. He opened his apology press conference in Spanish, and he is mostly beloved by the media. He is extremely entertaining. I don't know if we haven't had this conversation, but I think you like him.
I do like him.
Yeah, okay, because he makes our jobs easier, whether you like him or not. We talk about him every other day.
Because he has something to say. He's not
always
afraid.
has something to say.
And
he makes your job easier.
But is that reason enough, Skip, for the media to give him a pass?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen other guys get a pass just because he's been so good to them. To me, no. That's why I try to remain at a distance, at an arm's length, because in a vacuum, I'm saying he's getting a huge pass.
I really think
that shocks me.
Jim Leland would get fired if he said this?
I think La Russa would have gotten fired if he said that.
I
don't,
disagree with
Skip.
that.
Okay, now we get to the...
I think they would have gotten passes for being, for lack of a better term, naive about the
naive
subject.
about it more so.
And Ozzie should know better, especially being from Venezuela, where there's another dictatorship thing going on there. So he should know better than I think a guy like Leland or Tony La Russa. I don't think they would get fired.
Am I misjudging the outrage among the younger generations of Cuban Americans who just they don't share the hatred of Castro the way
That's a question for Israel. You live there.
They don't. And, I mean, I listened to Dan Le Batard about this a lot, and he says, his pain and agony is borrowed from his parents. He doesn't feel it nearly to the same level as his parents and grandparents and everything else. So, no, they don't feel that. And Gabby Sanchez was, again, a perfect example of that. So, but still, I don't think any of those guys would have gotten fired for this. And I think, but to your point, though, Ozzie even gets more leeway because he has a history of blurting out the absurd.
How many we hear it's Ozzie being Ozzie.
Right.
It's Manny being Manny.
So I think he got a pass in terms of a 5-game suspension. To me, still feels a little light in terms of he needs some time to reflect.
It's laughable. Of 162.
Skip, one question to wrap it up. You said your initial reaction was he should be fired.
Yeah.
You've heard from the Cuban-American community via this poll.
Yeah, I
You've
don't,
heard from Israel.
It's a small
poll.
It's
a small sample.
It's only 200 Cuban Americans,
but
it's a representative sample, whether or not it's completely scientific. And you've heard from Israel. The outrage isn't there from the group that should, you would think, be offended by this. Does that force you to rethink your initial he should be fired?
Yeah, you're pushing me back into the corner of, hey, maybe it wasn't that big a deal.
Are you ready to say that?
For those words to come out of my mouth on Monday, then I should have been fired for even thinking that, right? Because to me, still, from a distance, having studied the history of Cuba the way I have, it's a huge deal. But again, maybe you're right. Maybe it's just...
It's not as universal.
Yeah,
not everybody knows what you do.
Yeah.
Seems egregious. Seems the offended would be more offended.
Once again...
But they've spoken.
Old school. Maybe too old school.
But you know what?
You said it, not me.
Well, I just said...
I don't think the new school really, when you talk about it, like you said, I don't think that they know all the details or have felt that pain or seen it as like the older people.